There's been a large change in terms of thinking about research in general and research specifically related to patients. In the last few years, people have talked more and more about patient-centered outcomes research, or PCOR. This is a new philosophy. It really says that if we are involved in health decision-making, it's critical that we have research to help inform those health decisions that would be important for an individual patient to make the best decision. A lot of our research has been previously done focusing on outcomes that clinicians or researchers think are important. When we think about a condition like rheumatoid arthritis, we've been focusing on things like joint damage and joint swelling, and even inflammation markers in the blood. And while these are important to the researcher, and they're important to the clinician because they're telling us something about the disease, they're really not giving us the whole story. They're not telling us about the patient's piece of what they experience. Patient-centered outcome research tries to bring the patient experience into the conversation and tries to figure out what the best methods are to incorporate this type of perspective not only into the research itself, but also into translating those research findings into outcomes that are better for patients. Patient-centered outcome research focuses on a large number of different topics, including things like patient-reported outcomes. These are things like questionnaires that a patient would complete to tell us about pain or fatigue or sleep or other symptoms that they're having. But it's also understanding more about what patients' individual beliefs and attitudes and values are, because those are also important in terms of making health decisions. We haven't had very good ways to measure those things in the past, and that's part of the challenge of patient-centered outcome research, is developing the methods to be able to do these types of things better. Another important area and aspect of patient-centered outcome research is things like adherence to medications and understanding why patients may or may not take medications. And that involves things like beliefs. It also involves things like values, and it involves things like, do I understand why I need to be taking this medication? Do I understand why it's important for me to receive this to change the outcome of the disease? These are all the types of research that we're very interested in the center. Other parts of patient-centered outcome research require very special individuals with research skills that are not those that we've traditionally used in our research for people with rheumatic diseases. These include things like individuals who can conduct focus groups and interviews with patients. This is not just people getting in a room, sitting and talking to each other, but it's actually analyzing the data that comes out of that using metrics to really identify what people are saying, what common themes are being identified, and how these things might link together in constructing a concept that we're trying to measure or trying to study. Also going individually to patients and doing interviews to find out what a patient thinks about when they complete a questionnaire, for instance, is really important. And these are the types of things that we haven't spent a lot of time or energy on up to this point. We also need researchers who are experts in developing outcome measures. It's not enough just to administer a questionnaire to someone that says, how bad is your pain on a scale of 0 to 100? But we need to figure out better ways to ask those questions so that we can get to what people really feel is important. I'll give you an example of this. One of our researchers was interested in understanding stiffness that people with rheumatoid arthritis experience. Doctors, for years and years and years, have asked patients the question, how long does your stiffness last in the morning when you get up? Feeling that this was a good symptom indicator of the amount of inflammatory disease activity that was present. But this researcher went back to patients and conducted focus groups. And she asked patients, what do you think about when you think about stiffness in your joints or stiffness overall? And what she found out is that patients actually can't easily answer that question about how long are you stiff in the morning, because it's hard to quantify the time, and it also doesn't always occur in the morning. So patients were actually somewhat challenged in terms of understanding even what we were trying to ask them. But when she started asking patients about what stiffness meant to them, she got a very different story. And it was not only the duration or the amount, but it was the impact that stiffness had on people's lives. That was the language that was universal with the concept of stiffness. Everybody could relate to that. So now her research is working to develop a new questionnaire for stiffness that will actually put the questions in the language that patients use to describe the symptom. We think this is really, really exciting research, and it's an example of what we have been asking is not the best way to ask that question. We're doing patient-centered outcome research both within the Arthritis Center as well as across the Division of Rheumatology. We're working with our colleagues in the Scleroderma Center, for instance, to understand more about living with interstitial lung disease, or the lung disease that can often accompany scleroderma. How do the symptoms in the lung relate to the symptoms that people are having in their skin and in their joints, for instance? How can we ask about those to understand the differences between those two? We've also been working with our colleagues in the Myositis Center to ask people with inflammatory muscle disease how they experience their illness. Because to date, we really haven't had a good questionnaire to even ask about those types of symptoms. So these researchers are also doing qualitative work, asking patients how they experience their disease and what we need to measure and do better. Similarly, we have research that's going on in the psoriatic arthritis arena, where we're trying to understand how patients experience that condition, which links both joint complaints as well as skin complaints. We need to understand which of the two are most important for people. Which do we need to be asking you about if you have both of these conditions? How can we get that information so that we can then find tailored treatment that's important for you? We really think that this focus on patient-centered outcome research is going to change how we deal with people. We're going to see patients not as their diseases, but really as a person on the other side. And we're going to have methods to be able to quantify or help to classify people into different groups. One of the things we found with our research in terms of bringing patient-reported outcomes into the clinical care setting is that having that information fosters communication. It helps patients and physicians to talk better to one another. It helps patients to identify the symptoms that they're actually experiencing, and it gives a starting point for the conversation with the doctor about what's important. Our doctors have told us that that type of information helps them to know their patients better and really also facilitates the conversation. And our patients have said things like, gosh, I didn't even realize that my rheumatoid arthritis was affecting me in these different ways. But when I think about it now and see it on paper, I understand how it does. It really helps us to start a dialogue, and it helps us to identify what's important to one patient versus another patient.